In 1633, Galileo Galilei appeared before the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Rome, accused of vehement suspicion of heresy. His crime, according to ecclesiastical authorities, was having publicly defended and taught that the earth revolves around the sun, an idea contrary to the literal interpretation of certain passages of Scripture. For centuries, the history of this trial was known only through fragments and indirect accounts, many of them filtered or summarized by the Church itself. However, in the depths of the Vatican archives, the complete case file is preserved, handwritten pages, official seals, testimonies, interrogations, and the final sentence. In these documents, the tone is more complex than popular accounts usually convey. Far from being simply a trial of science versus faith, the file reveals a web of political, personal, and theological factors. Galileo was not a marginalized rebel, but a renowned scientist and friend of influential cardinals. In fact, years earlier, Pope Urban VIII himself had shown sympathy for his ideas, but the situation changed drastically due to the political climate of the time. Tensions with Protestant states, challenges to papal authority, and the fear that free interpretations of the Bible could undermine doctrinal control. Heliocentrism, though astronomically sound, became a symbol of disobedience. In the interrogation transcripts, Galileo attempts to argue that his proposal is not incompatible with faith, citing St. Augustine and other church fathers who warned against the literal interpretation of certain cosmological passages. However, the Inquisition insists that at least publicly he must recant his teaching. The pressure intensifies when he is reminded that in 1616 he had already received a formal warning not to defend heliocentrism. The file makes it clear that the trial was not an open debate, but a legal proceeding with an outcome virtually decided in advance. The most revealing moment in the archive is the letter in which Galileo, already old and ill, signs his abjuration. In it, he declares that cursed and detested is the error that the earth moves and the sun remains immobile. The signature is firm, but the handwriting irregular, likely due to tension and fatigue. There is a marginal note from the scribe indicating the presence of several ecclesiastical witnesses during this act, underlining the propagandistic importance of the event. The sentence condemned him to perpetual house arrest and to recite the penitential psalms weekly, a punishment which, though it was not the stake, marked the end of his public life as a scientist. But the most intriguing part is what is found alongside the file: private letters from Galileo to friends and disciples, unpublished until recent times. In them one perceives a man who, though he had officially yielded, maintained his conviction in the truth of the Copernican model. He even suggests discreet ways of continuing to teach these ideas without directly confronting censorship. Some passages hint that he hoped future generations, with greater freedom, would take up his work and vindicate it. The archive also contains internal Inquisition documents debating the strategy for handling the case. In one of them, a cardinal warns that too severe a punishment could turn Galileo into a martyr of science, something Protestants could exploit to attack Rome. This political concern explains why, despite the gravity of the accusations, a relatively moderate sentence was chosen compared to other heresy trials. Even more curious is an astronomical report found in the same folder, signed by an Inquisition consultant who cautiously admits that Galileo's observations are consistent with the calculations. This acknowledgement, hidden among legal and doctrinal pages, suggests that within the Vatican there were those who understood the strength of the scientific evidence, but that the historical moment did not allow for an open paradigm shift. Time proved Galileo right, but the Church took centuries to acknowledge it publicly. It was not until 1992 that Pope John Paul II, after a historical review, declared that the condemnation was an error and rehabilitated his figure. This delay in apology illustrates the symbolic weight of the case file. It is not just a record of a trial, but a mirror of the relationship between knowledge and power. When contemporary researchers have had access to these pages, they describe the feeling of standing before a silent witness to one of the most decisive moments in the history of science and religion. The paper, yellowed and brittle, still bears ink stains and annotations revealing the hands of several scribes. Each page tells not only the story of a man and his ideas, but also that of an institution that at that time felt threatened by change. Some scholars have suggested that in the same archive there may exist drafts or pretrial documents never shown to the public, perhaps with more candid internal discussions about the validity of heliocentrism. These possible texts, if they exist, could shed light on the extent to which certain high-ranking clergy understood the truth of the astronomical discoveries, even while officially condemning them. Thus, the Vatican archives preserve Galileo's trial not only as a relic, but as a reminder of how truth and power clash, negotiate, and sometimes distort themselves to fit within the limits of a given historical moment. It is in that contrast between the written evidence and the decisions made where the true weight of this episode is felt. Galileo's voice, though officially silenced, was trapped in those pages, waiting to be heard by future generations who, with the distance of time, can read them not as an act of submission, but as resistance disguised as obedience. For decades, the figure of Pope Pius XII has been at the center of intense debate over his role during the Second World War. The Vatican archives hold thousands of pages documenting his actions, his correspondence, and the instructions he gave to his diplomats as the world descended into conflict. Until recently, only carefully selected fragments were known, fueling controversy over whether the Pope acted as a prudent mediator or maintained a moral silence in the face of Nazi crimes. Among the most striking documents are encrypted letters sent from apostolic nunciatures in occupied Europe. These messages, written by bishops and papal representatives, describe in sober yet harrowing terms the mass arrests, the deportations of Jews to concentration camps, and the inhumane conditions under collaborationist regimes. In several of these reports, there are explicit requests for the Pope to intervene publicly to condemn such actions. The response of Pius XII, as revealed in some drafts, was generally cautious, appealing to discreet diplomacy to avoid even worse reprisals against Catholics and Jews. However, the pages also reveal another side, secret initiatives to hide and protect the persecuted. There are records of monasteries, convents, and church buildings in Italy and other countries, which, following unofficial instructions, gave refuge to Jewish families, deserters, and political opponents. In a document dated 1943, a monk in Rome writes to the Pope reporting that he has 17 Jewish children in his care and requesting guidance on what to do if German forces search the premises. The reply, brief, unsigned by the Pope himself, but attributed to his closest circle, states protect them, no matter the cost. The most unsettling aspect of the archive is the coexistence of these humanitarian actions with a public silence that for many historians remains incomprehensible. There is evidence that Pius XII feared that an open condemnation would not only provoke immediate reprisals, but also closed the only remaining door for secret negotiations with Germany and its allies. In an internal memorandum, an advisor writes that the voice of the Pope must be heard only when it can save more than it endangers. This calculated approach, intended to minimize harm, was interpreted by critics as a lack of moral leadership in the darkest moment of the century. The archive also contains letters from Jewish leaders after the war, thanking him for the help received in rescue operations, as well as others from survivors lamenting the absence of a forceful condemnation. The disparity of testimonies reflects the difficulty of judging decisions made in such extreme circumstances. Some documents even show drafts of speeches never delivered, in which the Pope planned to denounce the genocide explicitly, but which were withdrawn at the last moment on the advice of his diplomatic advisors. Amid the diplomatic correspondence are also coded messages confirming indirect contacts between the Vatican and representatives of the German resistance. In one of them, dated shortly before the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, 1944, the Pope is asked to intercede with the Allies to guarantee peace terms if the plot succeeded. This kind of communication shows that the Vatican acted as a secret channel in extremely high-risk political maneuvers, even if the final outcome was fruitless. Another significant find is a set of medical and intelligence reports on the physical and mental health of key leaders of the time, including Hitler and Mussolini. It is unclear how this information was obtained, but its presence suggests that the Vatican closely monitored not only political events, but also the personal weaknesses of the dictators, perhaps with the intention of foreseeing power shifts or exploiting moments of vulnerability. In Pius the personal notes, written in precise Latin and sometimes in Italian, there is a tone of anguish and resignation. He speaks of the unbearable burden of deciding who lives and who dies with a single word, and of the loneliness of one who hears the suffering of the world without being able to cry out. These reflections, likely never intended for others to read, reveal a man caught between compassion and political calculation. A lesser-known but equally revealing aspect concerns the post-war period. The archives contain documents on the so-called rat line, the escape network that allowed some Nazis to flee to South America. Although there is no direct evidence that the Pope approved it, certain members of the clergy involved in this network appear in internal reports without any clear record of disciplinary action. Some historians argue that this passivity may have been due to the Vatican's preference, amid the Cold War, for seeing these fugitives escape rather than fall into Soviet hands. The recent release of these archives has reopened a debate that had seemed stagnant. Some researchers conclude that Pius XII was a strategist who acted in silence to save lives, while others see him as a leader who failed to use his moral authority at the most decisive moment. What is clear is that the documents, far from offering a simple answer, reveal the complexity of governing during a time of global catastrophe. Every letter, every draft, and every marginal note reflects the tensions of a papacy that navigated between faith, politics, and institutional survival. The Vatican archives do not present a clean or heroic narrative, but rather a mosaic of contradictory decisions and unresolved dilemmas. In that sense, what they preserve is not only the history of a pontiff and a war, but the memory of how spiritual power faces the limits imposed by politics, fear, and the urgency to protect what it deems most sacred. And in those yellowed pages, filled with smudged ink and margins crammed with hurried notes, lingers the echo of a time when every word could save or condemn thousands of lives. Among the lesser-known treasures of the Vatican archives are letters written by Michelangelo Buonarroti to Pope Julius II, the very pontiff who commissioned him to decorate the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. These carefully preserved documents are not treatises on art nor poetic confessions, but practical, sometimes blunt correspondence that reveals the human and often tense side of the artist-patron relationship. The pages, many with slightly faded ink and wax stains, display a blend of formal respect and an impatience bordering on insolence. In one of the most cited letters, Michelangelo reminds the Pope that he has been waiting months for the agreed payment to continue his work. He uses no insults, but his phrasing drips with irony that remains evident even 5 centuries later. He writes that scaffolding does not stand on prayers alone, and that the quality of pigments does not improve with delayed money. The tone, direct and unusually frank for correspondence addressed to a pontiff, suggests that the artist felt secure enough in his position to demand what he considered his due. The archives also contain sketches and notes that Michelangelo sent along with his letters, with marginal annotations explaining design changes or technical concerns. In one of these sheets, he describes with frustration the challenges of painting monumental figures at great height, battling gravity, and the uneven drying of plaster. There is even a draft in which he seems on the verge of rejecting the commission entirely, arguing that his true craft was sculpture, not painting, although in the end, he accepted and produced one of the most famous works in history. Most fascinating of all is that within this correspondence are replies, presumably dictated by the Pope and transcribed by his secretaries, oscillating between firmness and an acknowledgement of the artist's genius. In one brief response, Julius II assures him that patience is as necessary for art as for politics, and promises that payments will be made in due course without specifying when. This more diplomatic than concrete style of reply must have exasperated Michelangelo, who was used to negotiating directly with princes and bankers. The tension between the two was not only financial. The documents suggest that Julius II had clear opinions about iconography and composition, which sometimes clashed with the artist's vision. In one particularly revealing exchange, Michelangelo defends his decision to include muscular, dynamic figures in biblical scenes, arguing that physical strength is also a reflection of spiritual strength. The papal reply, more pragmatic, reminds him that the work must impress the faithful and convey the power of the Church before the personal concerns of the Creator. Amid these disputes appear moments of mutual admiration. In a letter written after the completion of one section of the ceiling, Julius II congratulates the artist and admits that his work had exceeded expectations. There are even private notes from courtiers describing how the Pope, upon seeing a completed part, remained silent for several minutes before offering praise. These accounts paint a more nuanced picture. Though often fraught, the relationship was built on mutual respect for each other's talent and authority. A curious detail in the archives is the record of expenses linked to the project. There are lists of materials that include exorbitant quantities of lapis lazuli pigments, gold dust, and high-quality plaster. Payments to assistants, scaffold builders, and food suppliers are also noted, since the work required long days inside the chapel. Among the invoices are even purchases of wine and bread for the team, details that humanize the scale of the enterprise and remind us that behind the masterpiece stood a group working under demanding physical conditions. Some letters hint that Michelangelo, despite his complaints, understood the historic magnitude of what he was creating. In one brief but striking passage, he writes that this vault will be seen when my bones are dust, and that his duty was to make it worthy of the judgment of time and of God. This sense of transcendence, mixed with the everyday frustrations, gives the documents a significance that transcends mere anecdote. The Vatican Archives also preserve evidence of the forced interruptions the project suffered, often for reasons unrelated to art, political crises, papal travels, and tensions with other court artists. At one point, Michelangelo left Rome in anger over unpaid debts, returning only after a complex negotiation that included promises of greater resources and creative freedom. These episodes, recounted in exchanged letters, show that even the most iconic works in history depended on fragile balances between money, ego, and diplomacy. Not all in the correspondence is confrontation. There are passages in which Michelangelo expresses gratitude for the opportunity to work on a project of such magnitude. In one, he describes the light streaming through the high windows and how it bathes the frescoes at dawn, a detail more befitting a poet than a sculptor. This sensitivity to space and atmosphere partly explains why, despite his initial reservations, he transforms the ceiling into a work that marries technical rigor with emotional power. When these letters are examined alongside the administrative documents, a full portrait emerges of the Sistine Chapel's creation as a living process, full of negotiations, adjustments, and moments of sudden inspiration. The papers do not tell a linear story of commission and execution, but a tortuous path in which every advance was accompanied by tensions, delays, and disputes. Yet the persistence of Michelangelo and the sometimes reluctant commitment of Julius II to sustain the project gave rise to one of the Renaissance's greatest artistic achievements. Ultimately, these documents speak not only of a masterpiece, but of the human complexity behind it. They show how art, even at its most sublime, is born from profoundly earthly interactions, contracts, budgets, egos, fatigue, and pride. And in those pages, written in a firm hand and stained with the marks of the workshop, the exact moment is preserved when the creative tension between a stubborn artist and a demanding pope was transformed into something the world would admire for centuries. In one of the most restricted chambers of the Vatican Archives lies a document that forever changed the map of the world, the papal bull Inter Caetera, issued by Alexander VI in 1493. At first glance, it is a parchment carefully inscribed in Latin, with its lead seal still hanging from a silk cord. The solemn, concise text decrees that all lands discovered and yet to be discovered, west of an imaginary line in the Atlantic, would belong to the Crown of Castile, while those to the east would fall under Portuguese rule. What this document contains is not merely a territorial agreement, but the confirmation that the Church at that moment saw itself as divinely authorized to divide the planet among Christian kingdoms. Marginal notes accompanying the original text show that the bull was not the result of a sudden revelation, but of intense prior negotiations. Diplomats from Castile and Portugal, together with the Pope's advisors, exchanged proposals, adjusted coordinates, and debated navigation routes. Among the annexed papers are drafts with hand-drawn lines attempting to represent a world that in 1493 remained largely unknown. Some strokes indicate islands and coasts only vaguely outlined, perhaps based on the incomplete information arriving from Columbus's first voyages. One senses the effort to give shape to a geographical boundary at a time when geography was less an exact science than a set of conjectures based on sailors' and merchants' reports. The archive also contains direct correspondence between the Catholic monarchs and the Pope. In one letter, Isabella and Ferdinand thank the pontiff for his gesture, but hint that the demarcation line should be placed further west to favor their aspirations. Alexander VI's reply, though diplomatic, shows the pressure he was under. Portugal claimed historic rights over certain routes and was unwilling to relinquish them without compensation. This tension led, the following year, to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which moved the line and granted Portugal a portion of what would later become Brazil. Interestingly, among these documents are more confidential reports. Some describe the religious motivations behind the division, bringing the Christian faith to lands deemed pagan and barbarian. Others, however, reveal far more practical concerns, securing control of trade routes and avoiding conflict between two powers essential to the political stability of Christendom. In one internal memorandum, a papal advisor warns that if Castile and Portugal went to war over overseas territories, the enemies of the Church, particularly the Ottoman Empire and the emerging Protestant powers, would benefit greatly. The Inter Caetera not only established a physical division, but legitimized, at least in the eyes of Catholic Europe, colonization and dominion over entire peoples. Among the document's annexes are records of missions sent to prepare for the arrival of settlers, with detailed instructions on religious conversion, administration, and resource exploitation. In one letter to a bishop, it is stated that the land and its fruits belong to God, and to those he has designated as his stewards, a phrase that centuries later would be cited both to defend and to condemn colonization. One curiosity in the archive is a small notebook that appears to have belonged to a papal secretary. Alongside rudimentary calculations of maritime distances are personal reflections on the impact this division would have. The scribe wonders whether it is just that a sea without roads should serve as a frontier, and whether the peoples of those lands will receive the faith as salvation or as a burden. This intimate, off-the-record entry offers a more human glimpse of the doubts the official document does not reflect. In the same set of boxes housing the Inter Caetera are later testimonies showing the consequences of its application. Letters from missionaries describe first contacts with indigenous communities, alternating accounts of hospitality and cooperation with episodes of violence and resistance. A Portuguese report mentions clashes with Spanish explorers in areas both claimed as their own, despite the line drawn in Rome. These early conflicts demonstrate that, on the ground, the parchments sealed by the Pope had less force than the ambition and needs of each expedition. Over the centuries, the Inter Caetera has been cited in legal disputes, territorial claims, and moral debates about colonization. The archives hold certified copies sent to various European courts, as well as partial translations into Castilian and Portuguese for use in trials and litigation. They also preserve early criticisms from theologians who questioned the legitimacy of dividing the world without the consent of its original inhabitants. One such text, signed by a Dominican friar, argues that faith is not imposed by decree, nor is land given without the consent of those who inhabit it. Seeing the original parchment in person, according to the few researchers granted access, is a reminder of the power that can be concentrated in a few lines of text. The uniform handwriting, dark ink, and intact seal convey authority, while the content reveals the audacity of an era in which the world's political map could be redrawn at a negotiating table thousands of miles from the lands affected. The Vatican archives, with their ability to preserve not only the document itself, but also its entire surrounding context, make it clear that the Inter Caetera was not an isolated act, but the result of a complex web of interests, beliefs, and strategies. In its invisible margins pulse the voices of sailors charting uncertain routes, of kings seeking to expand their power, and of clerics justifying their authority as divine mandate. And like so many other treasures safeguarded in those rooms, it stands as a reminder of how ink and parchment can determine the fate of entire continents. Among the densest sections of the Vatican archives are the records of the Inquisition, a vast collection of case files spanning several centuries, documenting trials, interrogations, and sentences against those accused of heresy, witchcraft, and crimes against Catholic orthodoxy. These are leather-bound volumes with thick pages, marginal annotations, and seals attesting to their authenticity. Reading these documents reveals not only the rigor of inquisitorial procedure, but also the cultural, political, and religious tensions that fueled it. One of the oldest surviving cases dates to the late 15th century, when a bookseller in Florence was accused of distributing prohibited texts. The file includes a list of titles, many of them ancient works of philosophy and science, that the Church deemed dangerous because they might encourage interpretations contrary to doctrine. The interrogations, transcribed word for word, show the accused attempting to justify his sales as cultural exchange rather than the dissemination of heretical ideas. The sentence was moderate compared to other cases: confiscation of all his books and a substantial fine. In another volume, dated to the 17th century, we find the trial of a woman from a small Spanish village accused of practicing witchcraft. The case began with the denunciation of several neighbors who claimed to have seen her speaking to herself at night and preparing strange ointments. The document meticulously describes the search for evidence, the inspection of her home, the confiscation of herbs and objects considered charms, and the testimony of a local priest who claimed to have seen her performing an unauthorized ritual. During questioning, the woman insisted her practices were home remedies passed down from her mother, but the judges concluded these skills came from dark sources. She was sentenced to exile and forbidden from practicing any form of folk healing. The archives also preserve the records of book censorship. Entire lists from the Index Librorum Prohibitorum include annotations explaining the reasons for each inclusion. Some works were banned for containing theological ideas contrary to the faith, others for presenting scientific or philosophical interpretations that challenged ecclesiastical authority. In the margins of some entries, censors wrote comments sometimes more nuanced than the prohibition itself. In one, a censor admits that the work is brilliant and of great intellectual value, but that its circulation would be dangerous for the uneducated faithful. What stands out most in these files is the formality of the process. Every interrogation is recorded meticulously: date, time, place, names of those present, exact questions, and detailed transcriptions of the answers. Even in cases where the verdict was virtually predetermined, the appearance of an orderly, regulated trial was maintained. This bureaucratic structure served both to legitimize decisions and to archive them for future reference, either to guide similar cases or to justify doctrinal precedents. Some cases include statements of repentance drafted by scribes, often in language more eloquent than anything the accused might have said. These confessions were often presented publicly as examples to deter others. However, there are signs that not all defendants fully accepted these words. Some added small corrections or ambiguous phrases that hinted at disagreement. Among the most unsettling pages are the records of interrogations conducted under pressure or torture. Although inquisitorial manuals stipulated strict limits and conditions for its use, in practice these measures could be interpreted flexibly. The documents describe the techniques employed, the duration of each session, and the physical reactions of the accused. Sometimes the resulting confession was so confused or contradictory that it was difficult to consider it definitive evidence, yet it still served to justify a sentence. The political dimension of the Inquisition is also reflected in the archives. Some trials were initiated against influential figures for reasons that appear to be rooted more in personal rivalries or power struggles than in heresy. In an 18th century file, a nobleman was accused of sympathizing with Enlightenment ideas. The 17th century file, a nobleman was accused of sympathizing with Enlightenment ideas. The evidence consisted solely of comments made at a private dinner, but the denunciation came from a political adversary. Although the trial did not result in a severe sentence, the mere fact of being investigated weakened his position at court. Alongside the criminal proceedings, the records include instructions sent to local tribunals on how to handle certain types of cases. These directives show a constant effort to unify criteria and avoid contradictions, reinforcing the image of the Inquisition as a centralized institution, fully aware of its own power. Among them are warnings not to act hastily in small communities, where a poorly managed trial could destabilize social order. Not all documents portray the Inquisition as relentless. Some show a genuine effort to distinguish between superstition and heresy, or to protect the innocent from false accusations. In certain trials, judges acquitted the accused for lack of evidence, and there are cases in which denunciations were declared malicious, resulting in punishment for the accusers. These examples, though rare, demonstrate that the institution also recognized the risks of its own system. The sheer scale of these records means that many have yet to be fully examined by historians. The fragile yellowed pages preserve the echo of voices that would otherwise have been lost. Within them, accused, judges, and witnesses continue to speak across the centuries, reminding us that the history of the Inquisition is not only that of a repressive apparatus, but also that of an entire society negotiating the boundaries between belief, knowledge, and control. In the half-light of the Vatican archives, these files still wait, as if they could yet influence the way we understand the past and its lessons for the present. Deep within the Vatican's shelves, among diplomatic documents and papal bulls, rest ancient maps that puzzle even the most experienced cartographers. These are not merely artistic renderings of the medieval world, but meticulously drawn pieces that seem to contain information predating discoveries officially recognized by history. Some show coastlines outlined with a precision that, according to the accepted version, should not have been possible before certain voyages of exploration. One of the most discussed examples is a map attributed to a 15th century monk cartographer depicting the outline of South America in a form strikingly close to the real one, though with imperfect proportions. The legends accompanying this drawing speak of lands of spices and strange birds, and mention unbaptized communities long before Magellan's expedition rounded the continent. Scholars who have examined it up close have found corrections and overwriting in the lines, suggesting the map was updated multiple times, perhaps with information from navigators absent from official records. Another fascinating document is a Genoese port-o-land chart with zigzagging maritime routes across the Atlantic, marking islands whose existence today is uncertain or disputed. Among them is one labeled Antilia, a territory appearing on other European maps predating the discovery of America, but whose location has never been confirmed. Notably, the margins of the Portolan bear Latin annotations warning of treacherous currents and seas of mist, descriptions that match later accounts from sailors who crossed the North Atlantic. The archives also hold a miniature terrestrial globe, tentatively dated to the first third of the 16th century, that shows a large continent where Antarctica lies today, but without ice. This has fueled theories about the existence of even older maps, perhaps inherited from lost cultures, that might have reached European cartographers through intermediaries. More cautious historians suggest it could be a misinterpretation or an imagined representation, but the level of coastal detail remains difficult to explain. Some of these maps bear religious symbols, crosses, stars, and figures of saints that seem to mark strategic points for missionary activity. In some cases, the routes traced do not match the documented voyages of known explorers, suggesting there may have been unofficial or even clandestine expeditions, possibly dispatched by religious orders before European kingdoms publicly announced their conquests. Such hidden routes could have served to establish preliminary contacts or to assess resources before making public claims. Among the most enigmatic pieces is a fragmented parchment with a drawing of the Amazon basin, accompanied by a text describing a river so wide it takes a full day to cross, and peoples who build houses on the water. The dating of the paper and ink matches the late 15th century, decades before Spanish and Portuguese chroniclers left written accounts of those regions. This raises uncomfortable questions about what ecclesiastical authorities really knew and how they obtained such information. In a 17th century inventory, written in careful calligraphy, there is mention of maps reserved for the use of the Holy See that were not to circulate beyond certain circles. The stated reason was that they contained geographical details whose dissemination could cause disputes between Christian nations. Controlling geographic knowledge was no trivial matter in an era when trade routes and newly discovered territories could determine the fate of an empire. Possessing accurate information was equivalent to holding an incalculable strategic advantage. Some modern researchers have suggested that part of this cartography may have originated from networks of information exchange between missionaries and merchants who sent detailed reports on the lands they visited. The Jesuits, in particular, were known for their discipline in map-making and their skill in learning local languages, which allowed them to record river, mountain, and city names with great accuracy. Such data gathered in Rome could be compiled into world representations, far more complete than those known to most European courts. In other cases, the maps appear to contain deliberate errors, perhaps as a means of protecting sensitive information should it fall into enemy hands. There are coastlines shifted by several degrees, invented islands, and altered routes, which when compared to later versions, reveal intentional manipulation. This practice of deceptive cartography was not uncommon at the time and served as a way to assert control over knowledge, ensuring that only those with access to the correct version could navigate safely. The collection also includes nautical charts, richly illuminated with artistic detail, where the waters are populated by fantastic sea creatures, mermaids, tentacled monsters, and fish of impossible colors. While these embellishments may seem purely decorative, in some cases the figures are placed in areas known for real dangers, such as reefs or violent currents, This suggests that beyond the mythical, these images served a practical purpose as navigational warnings. Most intriguing is the way these maps, despite their diversity of styles and origins, seem connected to one another, as if they formed part of a larger archive aimed at building a global body of geographic knowledge long before the word globalization existed. The marginal notes, legends, and navigational markings are clues pointing to a coordinated effort to collect and centralize information about the entire world. Those who have had direct access to this section of the Vatican archives speak of the sensation of facing an incomplete puzzle. Each piece offers a glimpse into a past in which geography was power and secrecy a tool of control. These maps are not mere objects of study. They are silent witnesses to forgotten roots, unannounced discoveries, and the ambition of an institution that understood the knowledge of the world could be as valuable as the gold that flowed through it. In a section of the Vatican archives to which only a few specialists have ever had access, there are files related to official exorcism cases approved by the Holy See. These documents, though carefully cataloged and protected, do not form a single volume, but rather a dispersed collection of reports, letters, and records, some decades, others centuries old. The tone in most is sober and administrative, but their content records episodes that for those involved marked the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. One of the oldest cases, dated to the 17th century, comes from a small Italian village and describes a young woman who, according to witnesses, spoke unknown languages and displayed disproportionate physical strength. The report, prepared by a local priest, details the preliminary rituals, observation of her behavior, and the gathering of testimonies before requesting Rome's approval. Attached is the Vatican's reply, written in formal Latin, authorizing the exorcism with a specific ritual and a team of 2 additional priests. The subsequent narrative describes a series of sessions lasting several weeks, after which the young woman was declared freed from all malignant influence. Another file, this time from the 19th century, documents a case in South America. The priest in charge sent an extensive report describing strange phenomena, objects moving on their own, voices seeming to come from the walls, and sudden changes in room temperature. Notably, alongside spiritual observations, there are medical notes from a local doctor who could offer no satisfactory explanation, but recorded fluctuations in the patient's blood pressure and body temperature. The Vatican, after reviewing the material, sent precise instructions on the prayers and order of the ritual, along with a warning to proceed with caution to avoid confusing spiritual evil with physical or mental disorder. In some cases, the archives show that permission for an exorcism was denied. There are letters in which Rome requests more information or demands a thorough medical and psychological evaluation first. These documents reveal stricter criteria than might be imagined, and a consistent concern to distinguish between possession and illness. In one 21st century example, a bishop sought permission for a major ritual after receiving reports of inexplicable behavior in a young seminarian. The Vatican's carefully worded reply stated that sufficient signs had not been proven, and that instead conventional medical and spiritual care should be provided. Among the most unsettling documents are records of exorcisms that did not produce the desired results. One case in Eastern Europe in the 1930s describes a woman whose condition worsened after several ritual attempts. The priest's report speaks of episodes of extreme violence and utterances in ancient languages, including fragments in Greek and Aramaic that the exorcist himself did not fully understand. Rome responded by authorizing the participation of a biblical languages expert, showing that even in such matters, the Holy See drew on specialized scholarly advice. Not all exorcisms are described in dramatic terms. Some reports read almost clinically, with lists of prayers, response times, and notes on the subject's mood. In several, success is measured more by the return to ordinary daily life than by the disappearance of spectacular phenomena. One mid-20th century case recounts how a young mother, after a brief ritual, returned to caring for her children without experiencing the panic and aggression episodes that had isolated her for months. Other documents refer to rituals adapted for specific cultural contexts. In missions in Africa and Asia, exorcists authorized by the Vatican incorporated local elements, such as chants or gestures, provided they did not contravene the official liturgy. These cases reflect a certain flexibility, acknowledging that spiritual combat needed to take into account the beliefs and symbolic language of each community. Some files include eyewitness testimonies, sometimes written years after the events. Less formal than the official reports, these narratives vividly describe key moments, intense, inexplicable odors, sudden changes of voice, and the collective sensation that something had left the place. In some accounts, witnesses claim to have seen shadows or figures, though such mentions are treated cautiously in the official summaries. In the most restricted part of the collection are transcripts of recordings made during the 20th century, capturing voices and sounds during the rituals. Access to these tapes is extremely limited, and in most cases only fragments survive for reasons of confidentiality. Accompanying documents include partial translations and notes on intonations, pauses, and the subject's responses. The organization of these archives suggests that the Vatican saw these cases not only as spiritual interventions, but also as material for study. Indexes classify exorcisms by symptoms, duration, and outcome, pointing to an effort to identify patterns and improve the training of priests tasked with this work. Some recent reports recommend ongoing contact with psychiatric and neurological experts, showing that far from rejecting scientific knowledge, the institution seeks to integrate it to better discern such cases. Those who have worked with these documents agree that the experience of reading them is very different from the popular image of exorcisms. They are not always terrifying scenes. In many cases, they are long, repetitive, discrete processes focused on prayer and accompaniment. Still, there are enough intense and mysterious episodes to understand why the Church continues to see the practice as necessary in certain contexts. In the silence of the Vatican archives, these files embody the convergence of faith, discipline, and prudence. They preserve the memory of individuals and communities who, when faced with the inexplicable, sought help in the Church's oldest and most solemn rite. Between their sealed pages, the voices of exorcists, witnesses, and the afflicted still resonate, as if each case were a reminder that for some, the battle between light and darkness is not a metaphor, but a real, deeply personal experience. Within the vast correspondence preserved in the Vatican archives, one particularly delicate section contains the exchange of letters between the Holy See and various political leaders over the centuries. These are not simple diplomatic notes, but communications in which matters of faith, affairs of state, and negotiations, at times bordering on the clandestine, intertwine. Carefully stored in numbered boxes, and protected from deterioration, these letters reveal the Vatican's role as a global political actor, far beyond its spiritual mission. One of the oldest collections concerns exchanges with the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century. In these pages, written in formal Latin, the topics go beyond doctrinal disputes, such as the response to the Protestant Reformation, to include the financing of armies to halt Ottoman expansion. The tone varies depending on the recipient. Some letters are steeped in moral rhetoric and appeals to Christian unity, while others adopt a pragmatic and direct language, discussing supplies, transport routes, and temporary alliances. Another group, dated to the 19th century, preserves communications with European monarchs during periods of political upheaval. Among them are letters to Napoleon III discussing the status of Rome and the Papal States, as well as the Pope's concern over the spread of secular ideologies in education. At the same time, there are messages to monarchs of Catholic countries seeking support against liberal or revolutionary movements. In these lines, the Vatican appears both as mediator and as defender of its own sovereignty. Particularly striking is the correspondence with 20th century leaders, in which the tone changes notably. Latin is no longer the sole language of choice. French, Italian, and English are used as needed for diplomatic context. During the Second World War, exchanges with both neutral and belligerent governments reveal an effort to maintain open channels with all, even regimes hostile to the Church. Some messages are encrypted, with only the translations preserved, accompanied by marginal notes explaining the urgency or risk of the content. In a file labeled confidential, do not reproduce, there are letters from the mid-20th century between the Holy See and a Latin American president facing an imminent civil war. The content shows that the Vatican was aware of the plans of both sides and sought to negotiate a ceasefire in exchange for guarantees for the local church and its social works. Although the outcome was uncertain, these letters reveal a network of information and communication that went beyond what official statements admitted. In some cases, the letters reveal surprising closeness between political leaders and the Pope. There are almost personal exchanges, with references to previous meetings, greetings to family members, and comments on the recipient's health. Such gestures, seemingly trivial, could serve to build a bond of trust that later eased more complex agreements. In others, the tone is clearly tense, with veiled warnings about possible consequences if certain Vatican-aligned decisions were not taken. There are also examples in which correspondence served as a channel for discreet operations. During the Cold War, letters sent to a European head of state concealed, under religious language, instructions to allow the passage of agents and couriers carrying sensitive information. Marginal notes, in handwriting different from the official one, suggest that these letters were reviewed and sometimes modified before being sent to avoid directly implicating the Holy See. Not all the correspondence is grave or political. Some exchanges include congratulations for cultural achievements, support for humanitarian campaigns, or thanks for the restoration of historic churches. Yet even in these seemingly innocuous texts, there are hints of the Vatican's careful diplomacy, aware that a friendly gesture could open doors for more delicate conversations later. Among the most curious pieces are letters to leaders who did not profess the Catholic faith. In one exchange with a Muslim monarch in the early 20th century, the Pope praises measures taken to protect sacred sites of different religions and suggests an informal meeting to discuss the situation of Christians in the region. In another case, A series of letters with a Buddhist leader explore possible collaborations on peace and education, unusual for the time, and demonstrating the Holy See's diplomatic flexibility. A recurring aspect of these documents is the attention to detail, the form of address for each leader, the choice of paper, the seal used, and even the date chosen to send the letters seem calculated to maximize symbolic impact. In some cases, the letters were delivered by special envoys who not only conveyed the message, but also observed and reported the recipient's reaction, thus generating a two-way flow of information. Not all exchanges ended well. Some letters went unanswered. Others received terse or even hostile replies. These silences or rejections were also carefully documented, accompanied by analyses of possible reasons and suggestions for next steps. The Vatican appeared to understand that in diplomacy, every gesture or its absence carried a meaning to be interpreted with care. Today, those who have examined these letters agree they offer a unique view of the Vatican's role as a global interlocutor. Far from limiting itself to issuing moral pronouncements, the Holy See has long used the written word as a tool of influence, cultivating relationships that could last decades and in some cases shape the course of entire nations. In the quiet half-light of its shelves, these letters remain witnesses to a style of diplomacy that blends the tradition of the written word with the subtlety of undeclared power. Among the most persistent rumors surrounding the Vatican archives is the existence of a manuscript nicknamed by some researchers as the Gospel of Jesus, a text that, if real, would contain words attributed directly to Christ himself and not included in the canonical Gospels. There is no public record of such a document, and the Vatican has never acknowledged possessing it. However, veiled references in old correspondence, marginal notes in other manuscripts, and indirect testimonies have fueled speculation for centuries. Some clues come from partial inventories from the 17th century, where testimonies of the life and teaching of the Lord are mentioned that do not match any known biblical texts. The description is ambiguous, but certain researchers have suggested it could refer to collections of sayings or parables not recorded in the New Testament. In the same inventory, a marginal note warns that these writings must be specially safeguarded to avoid confusion among the faithful. This warning, written in Latin, reinforces the idea that the content could contradict or qualify the official interpretation. Another set of hints comes from letters exchanged between Renaissance scholars and officials of the Holy See. In one of them, an Italian humanist thanks the prefect of the Vatican Library for the opportunity to behold the undisclosed words of the Master, without specifying exactly what he means. Proponents of the Gospel of Jesus hypothesis see this is a direct reference to the manuscript, while skeptics argue it could simply be a metaphorical remark or refer to an already known apocryphal text of the time. Connections have also been made to archaeological discoveries. In the mid-20th century, during excavations in the Middle East, a team found papyrus fragments with sayings attributed to Jesus that matched no gospel. While some of these texts were published and catalogued as apocrypha, other fragments were never made public, supposedly because they were acquired by private collectors or religious institutions. Certain rumors claim that some of these fragments were quietly sent to Rome for study and preservation. Inside the Vatican, according to former staff, the most sensitive documents are kept in separate sections of the archives, with access restricted to a very small number of people, sometimes only with the Pope's direct authorization. If a manuscript of this nature existed, it would likely be under such control. The reasoning for such secrecy would be to prevent divergent interpretations from disrupting doctrinal unity, especially if the text presented a different image of Jesus than the one taught for centuries. Christian tradition has long coexisted with numerous apocryphal gospels, such as those of Thomas or Mary Magdalene, which offer alternative versions of Christ's teachings. However, the alleged gospel of Jesus would have a different status, as it would be attributed either to a more direct authorship or to a much closer temporal proximity to the events described. This would imply a potentially significant theological impact, as it could call into question the historical process by which the Gospels included in the biblical canon were chosen. Supporters of the manuscript's existence point out that historically the Church has collected and safeguarded documents that could be controversial or open to misinterpretation. They argue that official silence does not necessarily mean falsehood, but prudence. Critics, on the other hand, contend that the absence of tangible evidence, photographs or transcripts, makes the rumor more of a modern myth than a real possibility. Some writers and journalists claim to have received first-hand descriptions of the text's contents. According to these accounts, the manuscript is written in Aramaic, with sections in Greek, and contains extended discourses on forgiveness, social justice, and personal relationship with God, without emphasis on the hierarchical structure of an institutional church. If true, such a focus could have motivated its concealment, as it would contradict certain elements of the historical development of ecclesiastical authority. In the 1970s, an author specializing in religious history claimed to have seen a partial translation of the supposed gospel given to him in confidence by a priest who had worked in the archive. However, he never produced conclusive proof, and many consider his account a fabrication intended to sell books. Nevertheless, his story helped cement the idea in popular culture that somewhere in the Vatican lies a text capable of changing the understanding of Christianity. In recent times, some theologians have suggested that even if such a document existed, its impact might be less than rumors imply. They argue that faith is not based solely on historical documents, but on a living tradition, and that any new text would be integrated or dismissed according to established criteria. However, they acknowledge that its mere existence would spark intense academic and media debate, and would likely open a new chapter in biblical scholarship. The persistence of this rumor is partly due to the aura of mystery surrounding the Vatican archives in general. As an institution that limits access to most of its holdings and preserves documents of great historical and religious value, any ambiguous reference fuels the imagination of researchers, believers, and the curious. The fact that the Church has preserved for centuries manuscripts not included in the Bible reinforces the possibility that there is material even more exclusive and sensitive. Until clear evidence is presented, the Gospel of Jesus will remain, for many, a fascinating story poised between history and legend. The Vatican archives, with their silent corridors and endless shelves, will continue to be the perfect setting for the idea of a lost text, hidden from the world's eyes, to endure. Perhaps the truth will never come to light, or perhaps one day a chance discovery will open a box and reveal pages that have been waiting centuries to be read.